All right, Colin, I think it's probably good to go ahead and get started.
Yep.
All right. Guy, are you all set on your end?
All set.
All right, folks. So really excited today to have Guy Snodgrass with us. If you've been coming to these for a little while, you may have actually seen him about, gosh, I think almost 2 years ago at this point, Guy. I'm going to keep his bio short, sweet, and to the point. Guy has served in the United States Air Force for many, many years in his Air Force career. He retired as a commander, and one of his last postings was at the Pentagon, serving as Chief of Communications and Chief Speechwriter to General Mattis. And he also served as a Top Gun instructor for some time. And I think he's probably the best person to kind of give you his own background. So I'm going to turn things over. Guy, thanks for being with us. Here you go.
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks, Connor. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And so, is that coming up correctly? Okay, I'm getting some head nods. That's probably a good sign. All right, so like Connor mentioned, had an opportunity to spend about a 20-year career in the Navy, not the Air Force, which is hilarious because I'll never forget when I first started pilot training, and my mom's like, "How is the Air Force?" I'm like, "Mom, come on, I'm in the Navy, you know that." So it's funny because a lot of times when people know you fly planes, I think that's the automatic assumption is Air Force. But had a great opportunity to be part of the U.S. Navy for 20 years, had some really cool experiences. So that's really what Connor had asked me to do, is just to kind of walk through some of my experiences. And then as we do so, we'll just keep tying it back to scouting. And especially for those of us on this call and in this meeting who largely have a background not only just with scouting, but also with the pathway to Eagle. And some of the lessons and everything that I learned from that. So let me go ahead and get going here. So as he mentioned, spent 20 years largely in the cockpit, had some really cool experiences outside the cockpit as well. But I think, I love this photo because it kind of shares a couple of things. This was actually taken, this is me in an F/A-18 Echo, which is the Super Hornet variant of the F/A-18. I was a commanding officer for a squadron called VFA 196. They're the Dam Busters stationed in Japan. And so phenomenal tour in general, but then also I love this picture because when, men and women across the United States, especially those who've never served in the military or had any exposure really to military aviation, this is kind of what they think of when they think of fighter pilots, right? It's that guy or that gal sitting in the cockpit who's conducting a mission all by themselves, alone and unafraid. And then they come back, take off their flight gear, grab a bite to eat, and they go man back up to conduct another mission. And of course, as we all know, especially if you have had exposure to the military or any large organization, it's really a huge team effort. And so this is really kind of what the team looks like. This is one of our nuclear powered aircraft carriers. You've got that one person in the cockpit, but as you can see, the size of that ship compared relatively to the size of the aircraft on the flight deck, there's a lot of stuff going on each and every day just to be able to enable us to conduct these missions, right? So the aircraft carrier, we call it 90,000 tons of diplomacy just because of its size and displacement. But you can carry on, somewhere between 60 to 70 total aircraft on the ship. And that includes the helicopters. That includes some of the early warning aircraft as well. Well, to support those 60 or 70 aircraft, you have in total about 4,500 men and women drawn from all around America. These are the sailors who make it go. And so it's not just flying the planes, it's everything from literally cooking 4 meals a day to ensure that these 4,500 sailors can eat. It's the administrative work, it's the electronics, it's the mechanical work. It's everything that goes to make not only this city at sea function on a daily basis so we can go wherever in the world we're needed to be, but then also, of course, the aircraft themselves. And so that gets me a little bit into just kind of some of the backgrounds that were enabled from what I had learned from scouting and then also throughout my military career. So this is a picture. It's taken from the belly of a aerial refueling tanker. This is when I was flying a mission over Iraq during Operation Iraqi Freedom back in the mid-2000s. So just kind of a fun shot there, but I had some combat experience during that tour of duty. Also had a chance, like I mentioned, to be stationed in Japan for 2 tours of duty. The first time was about 3.5 years. I was kind of middle management in the military. I was a training officer and department head. So that's, certainly not the most senior individual like the commanding officer. It's also not the most junior. So it was a phenomenal tour to kind of learn and work alongside a lot of really cool men and women there. And then if you kind of get towards the tail end of my military career, when I was a Navy commander, I'd already had squadron command, was asked by Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis to come back to the Pentagon and serve as his chief speechwriter, and then also as the communications director for the Department of Defense, which was awesome, right? Because now you've got, you're at the pinnacle of an organization of 3,000 men and women, or excuse me, 3 million men and women, about 760 billion annual operating budget. So being able to work with him, be able to work with members of Congress and their staff, the presidential administration, all those things, you're behind the scenes in those rooms, learning and listening about leadership at the most executive level in the United States, especially for federal government. And then you take it one step further. We had a chance to fly in this plane. It's called the E-4B. It's known as the Night Watch plane. It's a National Airborne Operations Center. So, it's kind of a couple of cool facts about it. It's nuclear hardened. So if there was a nuclear blast in our vicinity, it won't affect the electronics inside the plane. And because of that, you're able to conduct nuclear strikes if we were required to from this plane. So it's part of the nuclear command and control structure. The other thing that was kind of an interesting fun fact, it has aerial refueling capability. So anytime we would fly anywhere around the country, or excuse me, the world, you're not stopping for gas. So we would take off from Andrews Air Force Base, and if we're going to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, if we're going to New Delhi over in India, it was just a straight 18 or 20-hour flight. And because of the way General Mattis tended to work, a lot of times we were up for a majority of it, just working and plugging along, trying to get ahead before we landed. And then, on a couple of occasions, 3 in total, was really honored, got a chance. Secretary Mattis asked me to run the meetings for the president, the vice president, and members of the cabinet whenever they would come over to the Pentagon and take briefings from us, right? So at that time, we've been talking about the 2018 National Defense Strategy, what the future of the military looks like. We partnered up with the Secretary of State to discuss, kind of our international presence with embassies and consulates. And so again, not only getting to run those meetings, but more importantly, I think to be able to be a fly on the wall and listen as these very senior individuals talked about, what is America, what is America's future, and then what is our place in the world, and how do we interact with our allies and partners, and of course, competitors around the world. So, when I think about a lot of the things that kind of underpinned what I have learned throughout my military career, I think that gets to the more exciting part of this here, which is Top Gun. And it's exciting because not only, I think, based on the age of a lot of the people on this call, probably saw the original 1986 movie, Top Gun, with, Maverick and Goose and all the players. And then this year in 2022, we had that sequel come out, Top Gun Maverick. And so it really kind of brought naval aviation and it brought Top Gun back to the fore. So this is the patch. This is what you earn when you become what's called a patch wearer in the Navy and Marine Corps. It's for the U.S. Navy Fighter Weapons School. That's the formal name for Top Gun. And Top Gun's a real school. It was born, as we would say, from the crucible of conflict. When you think back to the 1940s with World War II, that's when we really started becoming more robust with putting aircraft on board, aircraft carriers, sending them around the world to conduct missions. And we were really effective at it. We were really efficient as well. There's a number, which is kind of an alarming number, called a kill ratio. It basically means how many planes can you shoot down for every one that you lose. So during World War II, periods of time where we had an excellent kill ratio of 12 to 1 or 13 to 1. So we were shooting down 13 aircraft for every one we lost. And that's, from a military standpoint, that's phenomenal. It means that you're very survivable and you're very effective at conducting operations during conflict. You take that a couple, steps forward into the 1950s, and now we're in the Korean War, and that kill ratio had started to slide a little bit. So it went from, say, 13 to 1 down to 8 or 9 to 1. So not as effective. We're still able to conduct missions, but we're just not as effective as we were in World War II. And then you move forward into, the 1960s and 70s, right? The height of the Vietnam War. And that's the picture you see on your screen right now, right? So you got the aircraft carrier with those F-4 Phantoms that are lined up, ready to launch off into the wobbly yonder and conduct missions over Vietnam. And that kill ratio we discussed had plummeted down to like 3 to 1 or 2 to 1. And that was completely unsustainable, because it meant that you just simply, there's no way you could take the limited number of aircraft and the limited number of pilots, the limited number of people, and be able to sustain operations halfway around the globe. Because if you lose, say, 20 planes or 30 planes in a month or two, well, you have to find a way to resupply those. And it became a very untenable position for the Navy and for the Marine Corps. So that led to the formation of Top Gun. Back in the late 1960s, the Pentagon said, since this is unsustainable, we have to study this, figure out what we can do about it. There was a Navy captain named Frank Alt, who was basically charged to study the problem and put forward solutions. And in a nutshell, over the course of about half a year, did just that with his team. So they came up with a lot of different suggestions and solutions for finding ways to become more effective once again. But the biggest one that has not only made an impact then, but has stood the test of time now, was the creation of the Navy Fighter Weapons School, the creation of Top Gun. So in 1969, that report was released. They formed Top Gun. Some of you may remember that the original Top Gun was in Miramar, California, and that's where the first movie was based. And so the school was stood up, and it was a very quick success. They spent about a year or two training some of the pilots and the weapon systems officers from around the United States. Those individuals would then go back to the East or West Coast, continue to train those aircrew. And then, of course, now they're going to matriculate back into the theater of conflict in Vietnam. And you saw that kill ratio climb right back up. And there's a lot of reasons for it. If you have questions, I'll just put a plug. Obviously, please throw it into the chat if you want to get a little bit more specific or about the airplanes or the weapon systems, stuff like that. But Colin and Connor will be facilitating the discussion at the end. So if you have any questions, please just throw it in the chat. But like I said, Top Gun was a rousing success. And so, it was a phenomenal opportunity for me 5 decades later to be able to have gone through not only the Top Gun class, but then to become a Top Gun instructor and spend some time there. And so there's some questions that always kind of come up. I threw this one in for this audience because, I think a lot of times there's that evergreen question. People are always asking, hey, are leaders born? Are they made? Are you just inherently a great leader when you come out of the womb, or is it something that you can learn and you can be taught? I'll tell you, certainly my thought, as you can see, kind of that strapping young man in a scouting uniform back in high school, right? Leaders are made. I think you can have some advantages based on your family and the environment you're a part of when you grow up. But I was incredibly shy. I was not a very big go-getter before scouting. Was very kind of passive. There were a lot of things that scouting helped me develop to turn into the person you see on the right side of your screen, which was when I was turning over my squadron in Japan as a Navy commander. It also kind of evolves the question, right? Whenever I think back to Top Gun, same thing. What makes an elite team? And so that's what kind of led to the publication of my second book. That's the one you see on the screen here. It's Top Gun's Top 10 Leadership Lessons from the Cockpit. And so, it's kind of a twofer, right? I'd had the chance to go through the scouting program, had a chance to be an Eagle Scout, do Philmont, climb Mount Baldy, all the really cool stuff that scouting offers. And then you continued that pathway of leadership in the U.S. military, going to the Naval Academy, graduating, becoming a fighter pilot, and then having the chance to be a Top Gun instructor. And so I learned at a very young age some really incredible lessons. And then I saw those proven over time when I was working with incredibly senior leaders across not only government, but international with some of our allies and partners and in industry as well once I retired in 2018. So that formed the basis for the book. Hey, how do I tell some really awesome, cool stories that grab people's attention, but then you kind of set that hook and now demonstrate what do those stories teach you about leadership? What does it teach you about life and success in life? So that's the book, Top Gun's Top 10. All right, so these are just some kind of the lessons that you'd find in there. There's 10 of them in total per the title. So it's everything from focusing on your talent, passion, your personality, never waiting to make a difference, always having a wingman. We don't have enough time to really step through a lot of those. I just wanted to kind of throw them up there for your awareness. But there are a couple that I thought would be fun to discuss with you briefly today before we get to the Q&A. So the first one, nothing worthwhile is ever easy. Again, it comes from the book. And I think this one's probably an easy one to get your head wrapped around, because when you think about what it's like to be a naval aviator in general, it's tough. There's a lot going on, especially if you're going in and out of combat zones and you're conducting operations around the world on a daily basis. So one of the reasons why I say it's tough, I think a lot of people, when they think about Top Gun, they think about naval aviation. This is, again, that sight picture they see. This is a picture that was taken about 3 to 4 seconds prior to landing on board a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. And that's one of the things that make us so unique in the Navy and Marine Corps, is that if you're based on board a carrier, it's not like landing on board, or it's not like landing at a normal runway, right? So if you board a United, an American, a Southwest flight, you've got 10,000 feet of runway available, and you've got that long takeoff and and you get going. Same thing when you come into land. The Navy is very different. If you're operating from an aircraft carrier, you've got about just under 1,000 feet to land in. And it's kind of tough to see on this picture, but there's several big metal cables stretched across the stern end of this aircraft carrier. That's the arresting cables. Our planes have a hook that hangs down called the tail hook, and that's what will bring you to a stop. So you're flying along at 160 miles an hour, just like you see here. You know, this is you're in your cockpit, you're about to land, you're going 160 miles an hour, your tail hook is down, and then as soon as you crash into this flight deck, and it's a pretty abrupt jolt when you touch down, you want your hook to catch those wires, and it brings you to a very quick stop in about 2 seconds, right? So 160 to 0 in 2 seconds or so. And then when you launch, it's doing something similar in reverse. You're going from a standstill and you're getting shot off pretty quick. So that is, the sight view of the nuclear powered aircraft carrier. The other thing that kind of makes me think about is, okay, well, if that's tough, then now imagine doing it at nighttime. And so you've got the carrier still there, but now you have no horizon reference. Everything is pitch black. And this is actually on a pretty nice night when there's no weather, no lightning. You're not flying in and out of clouds, because sometimes that happens too, where you're in such bad weather. I remember being in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Japan. The weather was so bad. Not only was the sea state rough, which means the waves are incredibly choppy and they're very high, so the boat is pitching, it's moving very rapidly, but then also the ceiling for the clouds, it was so dense and so thick that you really couldn't even see the back end of the carrier until you're about 3 seconds prior to landing. So you're just flying around in pitch black until right before you touch down, which will definitely wake you up as you go through that. But super challenging to do that as well. And what I like to tell people is yeah, those are incredibly challenging moments in time. I'll never forget my first carrier landing. My legs were shaking. Just frankly, the thought of landing on a ship moving at sea was just incredibly challenging to me. And then you make it happen and you realize, okay, yep, you can find a way to do so consistent and repeatably. But then you take it kind of one step before, right? It's no longer just piloting a plane, it's doing something that's much more challenging in its just general nature. That's being a Top Gun instructor. When I was selected to be an instructor, it was back in 2005, was asked to join the staff, and I did so in 2006. They give everything. So if you think about Top Gun are the aerial experts for the Navy and the Marine Corps. That means you've got this small cadre of elite individuals that are responsible for all aviation warfare for about 500,000 men and women across those two branches of service, the Navy and the Marine Corps. And there's only about 22 to 26 Top Gun instructors at any one moment in time. And so every single instructor has a subject matter area of expertise. Mine was air-to-air mission planning, so I was an aerial warfare expert. And you have to go through this long, arduous murder board process. We can talk a little bit more about that in Q&A, but the bottom line is it's incredibly challenging. You have to give a 4.5-hour lecture from memory, no notes, can't look at your slides. You just have to, once you start rolling, you're on, and the Top Gun staff put you through a 6-month kind of leadership laboratory to make that possible. So definitely the biggest challenge in my career. And it kind of, when you think, once again, tying this back to scouting, right? So nothing worthwhile is ever easy. Very easy to dial in on that from my experience at Top Gun. But then when I think back to scouting, right? I mean, being exposed very early on, whether it was earning merit badges, whether it was making your way through the scouting ranks as you climb toward Eagle, there were challenges inherent in that, right? But they teach you how to create those bite-sized chunks. You got your qualification standards you have to go through. You've got the things you have to check off. And so it's just those one step at a time. And it teaches you that, it's tough to accomplish big things, but it's just one step at a time. And then kind of like you see here, picture, when you get around to doing your Eagle project, there's a lot to coordinate. I mean, it depends on what you choose to do. In my case, I wound up refurbishing an elderly gentleman's house. He was in his 80s. And so we refurbished his house and we completely repainted it. We did a whole bunch of work. And so you're working with vendors and you're working with, volunteers and everybody to make this possible. And when you look back and you say, wow, when you're 17 years old, being able to pull that off was pretty cool. And so I think from a very young age, scouting instills that in us. It gives you the capability to learn how to create success as you move forward. A few things when I think about nothing worthwhile is ever easy, I was going to share with you. At Top Gun, we say we only really care about 3 things with our graduates. It's your talent, your passion, your personality. You have to have talent because you've got to have a level of credibility. You have to be passionate. That's what keeps you going day in and day out, right? And so some of the best leaders across any industry are those who are incredibly passionate about what they do, because that just keeps that fire in the belly and it keeps you going forward. But personality is probably the most important of those three, because you could have talent, you could have personality, you could have talent, you could have passion, but if your personality stinks, no one's going to work with you or want to follow you. So you got to have those three things at least in equal measure as you go forward. The other thing too here, highest standards. I think back to scouting. Scouting has high standards, right? Leaving the campsite better than you found it. Scout law, going through all the different tenets that make a successful scout, and you have to maintain that bar. And so it's the same way with elite teams. If you're working with Navy SEALs, Top Gun instructors, et cetera, you set a very high bar, but it's not, you're never a jerk about it, but the bar is there, what the standards are, and you have to meet them as you go through. And then lastly here, again, kind of referencing back to scouting, but those small successes lead to really big accomplishments. And so that's something I thought scouting was very effective with for me, was saying, okay, look, you're not going to become an Eagle Scout overnight, right? It takes years, and it takes walking your way through earning your merit badges and going on campouts, doing all these things. They're going to get you the stepping stones you need for Eagle. And that kind of mindset really worked well, especially in the military community, because I think there's some parallels between scouting and finding success in another large organization like the U.S. military. And so all the things that I had learned in scouting really helped propel me forward in my military career. So that's, a little bit about my thoughts on nothing worthwhile is ever easy. The second one I was just going to share with you of those 10 is never waiting to make a difference. I think this is part of the hallmark of the scouting community, is that when you see an opportunity to make a difference in your community, make a difference as a mentor, to support others, to help others, then scouts are very willing to seize that and make those opportunities. And I think that is something that really gave me not only a leg up in life as someone who is a recipient, as a kind of a protege, but then more importantly, it teaches you those lifelong values of giving back to the community. And once you've reached a position where you can support others, then you do so, right? You're always wanting to give a little more than you're getting in that situation. When I think about this one, from a military or from a Top Gun perspective, a lot of times I think back to my time as a commanding officer for Strike Fighter Squadron 195. That's what you're seeing on your screen now. This is a picture of part of our squadron on board the aircraft carrier, the USS Ronald Reagan, when we were stationed in Japan. We're out at sea in this picture in the Pacific Ocean. And you can see that there's a couple things that stand out in this photo. One, you've got me front and center. I'm the commanding officer. I've got my left and right hand men in this case standing just to my side. But then behind you, you've got the ranks of sailors. And once again, if you think about this, that very front rank is where you have your pilots standing. They don't even make up the whole front rank. The rest are the sailors, the men and women who are the ones who are conducting all the work that makes aviation possible. So again, it's about those team values and about always finding ways to make things better. That's something we talked about at Top Gun a lot. How do you make today better than yesterday? And then how do you continue to do that day after day after day, right? So every single day you're trying to make it better than the day before. And that's what keeps those organizations working really well. I had a specific example I was going to share with you. I thought this one was really cool. So when I mentioned I had 2 tours of duty in Japan. The first time around, I was a Navy lieutenant commander, somewhere in middle management for an organization. I'd graduated from Top Gun. I'd been a Top Gun instructor, but now I'm back in the fleet and working with them. And so one of the things I noticed during that first tour of duty was that it was quite frankly bizarre. You have U.S. forces stationed in Japan for the sole purpose that if conflict ever broke out in the Pacific area or the Pacific theater, you've got China there, you've got Russia there, you've got North Korea there. There's a lot of things happening. So if you were to have conflict break out, you've got to be able to work alongside the Japanese. But here we are on this airbase. You've got a single runway, if you can imagine this, kind of running north and south. On one side of the runway are the American forces. The other side of the runway are the Japanese forces. And we never talked. There was no communication really between us, except maybe at the highest levels. But we certainly weren't working together or flying together. So now you fast forward, right? Never wait to make a difference. I come back, I'm the commanding officer for this fighter squadron. And that's one of the things I really wanted to change. So created a program, used a Japanese word called Benkyokai. It's basically Japanese for shared collaboration through mutual understanding and partnership. And so found through the Benkyo program, got permission from the government of Japan, got permission from the U.S. Department of State and Department of Defense. And then now we set up to form friendships with other Japanese fighter squadrons and start working with them. And it was awesome. because this particular photo was taken at Hayakuri Air Base. It was to the northeast of our base that we were stationed at. But we made a friendship with this squadron. They invited us up to their base. They walked us around the F-4 Phantom they were flying. We got to go to their simulators, meet their sailors. And then a couple of weeks later, we returned the favor. They came to visit us at Atsugi Air Base, which is where we were stationed. And then, that got the comfort level going. Now we're working together. And then you fast forward a little bit more, and now we're actually in a position where you can fly together. And so that's this next photo here is, this is a selfie taken. This is me in an FA-18 with the Japanese F-4 flying off my left wing. The first time that we had flown US forces and Japanese forces together like this, throughout history. And so now you take this type of an opportunity and you expanded it outward. And that's what we did for the remainder of my tour of duty there. It continues to this day. And that is, we have much bigger flights. You've got a lot of US forces, a lot of Japanese forces working together, conducting missions together. But it always starts, as you know, with scouting, right? It always starts with that first step, someone willing to make a difference, someone willing to do something different. And the squadron did that. We were able to reach our hand across the aisle and work more closely with Japanese. So that really kind of brings me to this photo. I love it. I love getting up and talking to audiences about this because of what it represents, right? Here's your F-18. There's a missile. It's one of our most advanced in the U.S. inventory. It's called the AIM-120 AMRAAM. It's a very advanced air-to-air missile. It's you use your own plane's radar to lock onto another aircraft. And then once you launch this missile, at some point, it uses its own radar to kind of guide in and blow up the enemy airplane. But the reason why I like it, and the reason why I talk about this, is because it really typifies hey, guess what? There's a lot of things that have to go right for this missile to work, but the number one thing that has to happen is you actually have to squeeze the trigger on the control stick. If you don't squeeze the trigger, you're never going to fire the missile, right? So the probability of success without taking a shot is 0. And so it's a lot of times, again, some of those things I had learned through my pathway in scouting was, take acceptable risks, find opportunities, look for ways to make a difference, and then squeeze the trigger, take a shot, and you'll be surprised usually with the positive results that come from it. Some of the things when I think about never waiting to make a difference, making things happen, don't let them happen. Again, I think that's a central tenet of Top Gun. It's a central tenet of scouting. Be proactive, don't be reactive, right? A lot of times if you start feeling like you're back on your heels, it's because you're letting events happen around you and then you're simply reacting to them. And that's something I felt scouting was really good at in my case, was saying, hey, no, if you want to chart a path, you've got to figure out how to make it work and then be very proactive in carrying that out. And it's a great life skill that, having gone through scouting, really stands out. And especially with other scouts that I've had a chance to work with throughout my career, both in uniform and out as well. The other one here is just innovation, culture of adoption. So when you think about scouting and all the changes that have come to the organization as a whole, but then certainly as a scout going through the program, it just you're exposed to a lot of things that you might not normally have been had you not been part of the organization. And I think that opens the doorway to being more accepting of others in general, but also more accepting of the changes. And when you know a lot more, right, you create that reservoir of knowledge, then that allows you to be more impactful and effective as a leader because you have a breadth of knowledge, and you could be in a very specific situation, but you can reach out and start kind of drawing those threads to other opportunities that are out there, and you pull those in and you help get to success. All right, and I apologize. I'm looking at 2 different screens. The second one here was leaving the campsite better than you found it. I referenced that a little bit earlier, but that's something that I talk to a lot when I do keynote speaking, when I work with groups as a consultant. But that is, I love telling the story about my scoutmaster and scout leaders. Every time you'd go to a campsite, right? Hey, you're going to leave the campsite better than you found it. And I think that's not only just a great lesson from scouting, but it's a great life lesson. It's a great lesson as a leader in industry, because if you've got that mindset, you could be anywhere in the organization, but as you move up the rungs, you're leaving your team, you're leaving your group even better than you found it, with the expressed expectation that the person behind you is going to do the exact same thing, right? And that's how you continue to propel an organization forward. All right, as we kind of step towards the end here, getting the more fun part, right, which is Q&A. At the end of the day, effective leadership is always about having really good values. And I think that's where scouting makes a huge difference for the men and women who go through it. Getting a chance to work with adult leaders, getting a chance to be exposed to things that you would have been unaware of otherwise. And then, of course, all the leadership and all the values that scouting teaches you really stands out as you move forward in your career. You know, you look at this picture here, one of the things that I think people find very funny is that, hey, when you're in a fighter plane, it can go Mach 1, you know, it can go incredibly fast moving forward. You can break the sound barrier. But once you land, there is no reverse thruster. There's no way to back up or put your plane into reverse. So when you land on an aircraft carrier, usually you have a tractor and you have a tow bar that you hook up to the front of your plane, and that pushes you back into the spot you need to be in. But a lot of times when that tractor is not available, then you hear that call come on the radio. So this is aircraft 201. It's landed. It needs to be pushed back. There's no tractor available. So the air boss or the mini boss who's in the control tower will get on the radio and say, aircraft 201 needs an immediate pushback. And man, it's phenomenal when you see all these guys and gals running across the flight deck to make that happen. Doesn't matter if they're in your squadron. They may have nothing to do with this aircraft. Each of these different colored jerseys you see on the slide do a different role. Maybe they're wearing red, and so they work with weapons and bullets. Maybe they are wearing yellow, and they're the flight director. Maybe they're wearing green, and they repair engines or work on avionics. Doesn't matter. At the end of the day, they're grabbing a hold of this airplane, and everyone's working together as one team to push it back, right? So it's that teamwork, it's that unity of effort, and that's something I think scouting is phenomenal with teaching. Mentioned 2 tours of duty in Japan, right? So teaching you perspective, respect for unique cultures, another element that really resonates loud and clear and came from scouting and from your community as well. Effective communication, you know, anytime you served in a leadership position as a young adult going through scouting and you got to get up in front of the audience, and I'll never forget the first time I did it, you know, like I mentioned, I was very shy, not, you know, comfortable in front of an audience speaking. And so once again, scouting kind of teases that out of you. You got to do it. You got to get up. You got to actually find ways to communicate effectively and work with others. And that same type of skill really paid off throughout my career. Knowledge and networks, we kind of touched on this one, right? So not only are you building and developing those relationships with scouts and leaders within your own troop, but you're going to jamborees, you're going to other scouting events where you make friends and create friendships with other scout troops and beyond, right? Or maybe into business with some of the businesses that support the scouting community. And so that's just a small taste of what it's like as you move forward in your career and you get a chance to really develop those networks and continue to build friendships that are going to help not only you be successful, but more importantly, the organizations you're part of to really be more successful. Obviously, one of the biggest things, and I think this resonates loud and clear, not only in the U.S. military, but certainly within those elite teams, is the concept of servant leadership. Always putting the men and women who you're in charge of before you put their needs before your own needs. And I've been very pleased throughout my career to serve alongside leaders who are like that. They'll work 18 hours in a day if they need to make sure that their sailors are well taken care of, or the individuals that they're charged with leading. And that was a huge part of it. Perseverance, another one that comes straight from scouting, but I think resonated with my time as an aviator and at Top Gun. You're always met with challenges. A lot of things come up that you never expected, but you just stick with it. You find a way to, as we would say, adapt and overcome and continue to excel as you move forward. So, kind of two thoughts here before we switch over to Q&A. Number one is I was going to highlight the book. Hey, it's Christmas time. So if anything I've mentioned sounds kind of neat to you, if you want to see some cool sea stories or read about some fun stories in the cockpit, it's a great chance to snag a copy. They've got them at Barnes & Noble. They've got them at Amazon. And I say that specifically because every time I go out and do public speaking, I'm always bad about doing the ask, which is saying like, hey, check it out. You might really enjoy the book. But more importantly, it's very much aligned with scouting's values. And so if you've got those young adults around you or individuals you'd want to hand a copy off to, it can help make an impact and maybe clarify or crystallize their thought as they move forward. The last thing I'd say is just that's a big part of what I do these days. I do a lot of consulting work. I work with a lot of really great teams across America, but in the last year or two, I've been asked more and more to conduct keynote speeches. Just came back from one in Nashville where I was speaking in front of 2,000 people, drawing kind of some of these threads a little bit more and tying it to industry. But if you're in a position where you either need a speaker or if you know people you can connect me to that are looking for speakers, that's something I'm looking to really develop as I move into 23 and beyond. So with that being said, I really appreciate Connor kind of reaching out, asking me to chat with you today. We can go ahead and kind of stop there, maybe switch over to some Q&A, and happy to have a conversation with the remaining time we have. Thank you very much.
Sounds great. Thanks, Guy. That was fantastic. And I'll add my own little endorsement here. I haven't read Top Gun's Top 10, but I have read Guy's earlier book about his time with General Mattis. and he really is a very engaging writer. So I'd recommend, even if you're not getting it as a gift for someone else, it's worth it to read that on your own. I think he's a really solid writer, which I guess is what you would expect from someone who did speech writing at that level for a period of time.
Occupational hazard.
Yeah, we'll just jump right into it. We have a couple people who are kind of popping questions into the chat there. First question from Pete: how was the training you received in the Top Gun program different than the previous naval air combat training that you had received?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, if you think about my career path leading up to Top Gun as an instructor, you do the same thing every other guy and gal does to become a pilot, number one. Then you've got to go through some advanced training to become a fighter pilot. And then once you've done that, now you're with your initial squadron, and that training continues for some period of time, usually for about 2 years. You've got to go through additional qualifications. There's only so much you can do before you get to your first squadron. And now you're actually using the combat aircraft and you're continuing that training. And as part of my training, we were in Operation Iraqi Freedom. So you learn a lot. You learn, it's kind of different because you learn a lot about the weapon systems. So you're an expert in the F-18. You're an expert in aerial combat in a lot of ways. But then you really accelerate that. And I think that's the nature of any elite team in America. It could be Navy SEALs. It could be Top Gun, like I went to. It could be some of these small groups within other companies in industry, right? So if I'm kind of more familiar with tech and innovation, but if you think to Tesla, SpaceX, Amazon, Blue Origins, there's a lot of these companies that are kind of on the vanguard of technology. And usually within each of those companies, there's kind of a small group that focuses on innovation and forward thinking. And that's really the role Top Gun kind of plays. So you not only spend some period of time becoming a much more well-honed instructor, and that's the nature of Top Gun, right? You teach the other teachers who then go out and teach within the fleet. And so that's, the standards are very high, but Top Gun really honed that to a sharp edge. And then on top of that, the thing you got at Top Gun you didn't necessarily get in a lot of other places was just a real solid focus on leadership. Developing the skill sets required to find success, right? And to be very credible. And so now you're expected on a routine basis to get up in front of a room, maybe of 300, 400 people, your peers, and to be able to lead them and teach them as you go. So I found it to be very rewarding, very challenging, and in some points uncomfortable. But I think, again, that's the nature of elite teams. It's pushing you to the very edge of what you felt you were capable of and what the organization was capable of. And then you kind of meet that mark and you say, okay, it's doable, right? And so that's really what I think, whether it's through scouting, whether it's through these elite teams, it really, we call it the envelope in aviation, but it's like it stretches your envelope. It really forces you to develop and grow and to realize that some of the things you thought were impossible 2 weeks before are not only possible, but they're consistently achievable. And so that's something that you take away and you continue to teach others in aviation.
Thanks, Guy. That was a great answer there. Question from Colin, and I think this is something that I've seen asked every single time I've seen you speak, and it's not surprising. He saw that your call sign was listed as bus, and he'd like to know what's the story behind that, and I guess as an addendum, if you could just sort of explain the tradition of call signs in general.
Sure, yeah. So aviation call signs are a big part of that. There's only really kind of two rules regarding call sign. Number one, you never get to pick your own call sign. It's always assigned to you. So that's like a hard and fast rule. You don't get to pick a cool name that you want. Someone's going to give you a name typically you don't want. The second rule is that once you've been assigned that name, it's pretty much stuck with you for life. So when you think about some of the fun call signs I've run across, there was a guy at Top Gun. His call sign was GIMP. G-I-M-P. It was an acronym. And I remember asking him, like, hey, what's GIMP? And he's like, yeah, it's Guy Inebriated Missing Pants, because he'd gone to a wedding, had a little bit too much to drink, next thing you know, he's shedding some clothing. And so his call sign became GIMP, and it's been GIMP for his entire career. Same thing. We had a guy who was on the flight deck of an aircraft carrier, and he didn't realize his radio was stuck on. And he's super upset. He's yelling about something. So he's using a lot of profane language. And so his call sign became cuss. And again, it's like, once you're cuss forever. So my case, it was bus, a little bit of an opposites kind of a call sign. When I had first joined my squadron, and especially as I was going through training, I was kind of this scrawny 145-pound soaking wet type of guy, tall, skinny white guy. And then you show up at my first command, and that's when the Pittsburgh Steelers were kind of the team in the NFL to beat. And they had a running back named Jerome Bettis, who was like the stark opposite. He's this giant brute of a black guy, running back, just give him the ball, he'll punch it in. And so I remember the squadron guys were looking at him and looking at me and like, man, you couldn't pick someone who's more opposite than Jerome Bettis than Guy Snodgrass. So that's how I got the call sign Bus, and same thing. It's stuck ever since.
Awesome. Thank you. Question from Dr. Malinchak. How realistic do you feel the 2 Top Gun movies were based on your experience?
Yeah, great question. It's funny. Both movies were very realistic when it comes to the flying scenes. The U.S. Navy, I think, in kind of let me take a step back and say, I think one of the worst things that the military does is it's a little bit of a walled garden. The military is not comfortable usually talking about self, sharing about self. Some of that maybe is institutionally, and that, again, like scouting, right? It's about being that humble professional. You let others brag about you. You don't brag about yourself. So it's about being humble, about having humility. But I think sometimes the military can take that to an extreme to their detriment, which is, hey, they don't like to talk a lot about what they do, what they provide for the American public. And so that creates a little bit of a gap there. And so that's one of those things where, when you think about the Top Gun movies, I thought that was a little bit of a flash of brilliance, that not only did Hollywood want to champion kind of a unique storyline with the military, but the U.S. Navy actually said, we're going to participate officially. We're going to help you. And so they put cameras in the aircraft. They put cameras all around. So they captured a lot of amazing flight scenes, both in the 1986 original movie, but then subsequently in this 2022 sequel. And so that part is very realistic. Some of the pilots I trained in Japan who were part of my squadron were actually the ones flying Tom Cruise, Glenn Powell, Miles Teller in the sequel. So they've got some really cool stories about that. But the other parts of it, the kind of over the top, we're gonna, in this sequel, we're gonna take 4 planes to fly into Iran essentially and bomb this tiny hole in a cavern. That's not really realistic. So when you think the macro story, there's always that Hollywood, we're going to dial it up to the extreme level just because viewers will love it. But then the flying scenes I thought were really good.
Awesome. Thank you. Jim Splitt just kind of tossed into the chat here and mentioned that his scoutmaster and Little League coach was Commander Elmo Zumwalt.
Oh, wow.
So Commander Zumwalt had a pretty significant role in Navy history there.
Yeah. Wow. Fascinating. I'd love to hear some stories from Jim, because I'm sure he's got some interesting ones. Elmo Zumwalt was one of our more famous chief of naval operations officers. So he basically rose up through the ranks to become a 4-star admiral and made a huge difference to the U.S. Navy, especially when you think about the time frame that he was coming up. So that's incredible.
The only thing I might add to that is the fact that he always had time for us. As a coach, scoutmaster, he was there with us. And there was where I grew up, it was either commander this or sergeant or lieutenant, all of the, there was hardly any misters in the neighborhood. But the takeaway was that he was available. And then his son, Elmo, who was a classmate of mine, unfortunately, he had Agent Orange in his system, and it caused his death. But anyway, there's a lot of good stories, and my dad served as the public relations officer under many administrations back to Forstall. Connected there in a lot of ways. So thank you.
Well, and I love what Jim just mentioned, right? The fact that that's kind of that theme I talked about earlier is I love that part of scouting. The fact that you could take people who are very well accomplished, luminaries in their own right, kind of like he just mentioned with Admiral Zumwalt, but and then Commander Zumwalt, but they make the time. They realize the impact that they can have, the positive impact they can have just by giving of themselves and saying, look, I mean, I'm going to share some expertise, some knowledge, help guide this troop and provide and be a resource. And like Jim just said, hey, this guy who became a really influential individual within the Navy, already was, I'm sure, at that point, but then became even more so as a more senior leader. But just like he said, being available. And I think about that a lot. I suspect everybody on this call thinks about that as well. Who made differences in my life? How did they do that? And then, so what are the ways that I can continue to give back? What are the ways we can continue to give back that will make a a tangible impact. And that's what's neat about it, right? So if you've got then Commander Zumwalt saying, I'll be a scoutmaster, well, then now you're affecting all the scouts within the troop, right? So you can amplify that effect moving outward. And to tie it back to kind of today's theme, I mean, that's the nature of Top Gun or any of these kind of small elite teams is small number of individuals who can have a real outsized impact to a greater community. And so scouting is phenomenal for that. So thanks, Jim. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, great conversation there. What a neat coincidence. I think actually I think there's two folks in Congress right now, Congressman Sessions and Thompson, and both of them have served as scoutmaster to their kids' local troops while in office. It's pretty neat to see, people in positions like that giving their time to kind of the most local level of scouting. A question from Dr. Malinchak. Have you ever seen a UFO? And if so, can you tell us about it?
I can't tell you about it. No. It's funny you say that. I'll never forget. So maybe 3-4 years ago is when there was kind of this resurgence, this new uptick in talking about UFOs. And there were actually some Navy individuals who were cited because of the footage they'd taken. And in this one case, there was this really fascinating footage of, we called it the Tic Tac, but it was basically like this kind of Tic Tac shaped white object that was captured by an F-18 on its infrared pod. And they could see it visually with their own eyes, and it could do these amazing things that no other aerial aircraft should be able to do. The reason why I say it's fascinating is because when I was back in 2005, I was going through Top Gun as a student. One of my wingmen, his name's Josh Appizato, Navy lieutenant at the time, and he was the person. He was in the backseat of that plane that captured the footage. So if you kind of go all the way back to 2005, and none of this had been publicly available, but he was telling us the story, and we're all like, "Get out of here!" That's the most ridiculous thing. And he swore, up and down. He's just like, "It's real. I saw it." He was getting kind of flustered that we weren't believing him. And then you fast forward, like whatever it was, 17, 18 years, and then it becomes public and everyone's talking about it. So unfortunately, no definitive answers for you, but I thought it was fascinating that I've actually, flown with some guys and gals who have seen some fascinating things, and they can't characterize it as something that would be obviously American or traditional in nature. So
that's pretty crazy stuff.
Yeah.
Question from Matthew Simon. How did you come to the decision to join the U.S. Navy, and in particular, to become a naval aviator?
Sure. Again, direct line back to scouting. So I grew up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. That's actually where I'm living right now. And my scout troop, Troop 28, was in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. We've got a couple air bases in the vicinity. We have one that's called Naval Air Station Fort Worth. And every year they would hold their air show. And so usually alternating years, you'd either have the Blue Angels or you have the Thunderbird demonstration teams come to fly. And so now you take me as like a 12, 13-year-old, kid growing up in this area, and we would always do our annual fundraising at that air show. And so here we are in our trailer, we're selling stuff as scouts to help fund our campouts for the year and to get set up for film op. And you're watching these planes go overhead, and you get a chance to go and check out the static displays where they've got the planes parked and you can talk to the pilots. And that's really what continued to instill the love for me. I had a gentleman in my church who was an engineer at General Dynamics, which became Lockheed Martin once they sold the planes to him. But we had a production plant in Fort Worth, same thing. He'd bring me those glossy brochures. So again, it's that same thing we just got through talking about with Jim. The fact that you've got these individuals, whether it was through my church or the scouting community, that saw that I had an interest in aviation, and then they just kind of went full tilt and would give you the as much time as you needed to ask questions and determine if that's what you want to do. And so I knew at a fairly young age, and as a teenager, that was my dream, was to be a fighter pilot, and had a chance to pursue it. And with some great mentors and teachers, continue to persevere and strive for it.
Thanks, Guy. Question from Jim Splitt. How are drone pilots changing wartime strategies?
Yeah, that's a great question, because there's probably a ton in there to unpack, right? Maybe you break it down to the 3 levels that we think about in the military, and a lot of organizations think about it, maybe not explicitly like this, right? But you've got kind of that grand view, the strategy, then you've got kind of the operational level, and then you've got the tactical. If you think tactically about drones, right, they are capable of doing things manned aircraft cannot do. We always talked about the fact that as aviation has progressed, as warfare has progressed, the planes are more capable of being more maneuverable, more dynamic than the person sitting in the cockpit. And so that was something we recognized, was that typically the biggest limitation for what a plane can do is that man or that woman in the cockpit, because physiologically you have to be, you have to stay awake. You can't pass out. There's a lot of things that have to be accomplished. And that means all these life support systems have to be in the cockpit to help facilitate that. So when you start finding ways to take that individual out of the cockpit, you not only can let the plane unlock its full capabilities, but then you also can do things that maybe you wouldn't be as comfortable with an individual in the cockpit. So there are some areas where drones. So I think the two biggest things are the plane that's an unmanned aircraft can perform maneuvers that are more dynamic because you're not concerned about hurting someone. You could also potentially send them into locations that you wouldn't want to send a manned aircraft because it's too risky of a mission. It's too deadly. So far better to risk an unmanned aircraft than pay possibly a manned aircraft in that scenario. I think, I mentioned there's a lot of ways you could unpack this. If you draw that all the way out to maybe the strategic view and the theoretical view, what does this mean for aviation and for warfare? That's where it becomes a little bit more murky, because much like we're seeing in Ukraine right now, there's a use of drones, there's a use of a lot of standoff weapons. And that's the concern by theorists, is that if you were to move to having drones conducting a lot of combat, it really reduces the threshold of pain, if you will, the threshold of it becomes easier to say, hey, let's just send drones to go conduct missions. And so you might find yourself being more willing to get into conflict because the barrier to entry is lower. And so that could have a potential impact on the character of warfare as we move forward, as they become more as they propagate further into the mainstream, and you're no longer putting people at risk, you're just putting machines at risk. That could increase the incidence for conflict in the future.
Awesome, thank you. Just a comment in the chat from Christopher Bishop, who just threw in his own voucher for the book and said that it was really a good book, good read. Question from owner. I think maybe the name was input wrong there. Hey there, I see you. Is it possible to get a copy of the top 10 list? And just also mention that he's retired Navy and served on the carrier America as CMC.
Oh, wow. Fantastic. Well, thank you, sir, for your service. Yeah, through Connor. If I can get your email address, then I can easily send you that list and make sure that you have access to it. So thanks for asking.
Yeah, we can make sure that we make that happen. And let me go back quickly. I think I missed a question earlier in the chat here from Dr. Malinchek. I think you mentioned it at some point in your talk about how the U.S. military is sort of the number one on the global stage right now. And he asks sort of, who do you feel is number 2 and 3? And do you think that they could ever defeat the U.S.?
It's an interesting question. So so if you think about military capability, I do think that the United States is certainly number one. And for a number of reasons, we have a large military. It's incredibly well funded. We tend to expend on an annual basis the most dollars to not only field but also train a highly advanced military force. But then also we've kind of, because of our experience, we've been, for better or for worse, we've been in conflict for the past 20 plus years for the war on terror and other operations globally. And so we have a lot of experience that other nations don't. And then you also take the fact that a lot of our training is joint in nature. So it's not just the U.S. Navy being out at sea doing Navy things. We want to focus in on how do you bring the full power of the armed forces to bear. And so you take the capabilities of all the branches of the armed forces and you have them work well together and integrate so that you can put the right asset, the right tool against the right challenge at the right time. And of course, that's just military focused. I mean, the reality is we're very good at what's called the whole of government approach. And so now you're bringing in, the economics of conflict or technology or satellites. I mean, there's so many things that you can do that amplify our capabilities. So the U.S. is very, very good at what we do. If you think about other nations, that's what's kind of the beauty of how America integrates with the world. We have a long list of allies and partners. You have NATO nations for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, primarily nations in Europe. We have allies in the Indo-Pacific theater, such as Japan or Thailand or the Philippines, South Korea, and Australia. So, I mean, a lot of these nations don't necessarily have the same military capability, the cyber capability, the space capability the U.S. does, but they have very bespoke and tailored capabilities. And the Israelis are a great example of this, where they're very good and very proficient at some areas of technology and military capability. And so we can partner with them when it makes sense to do so, right? So it amplifies our capabilities. When you think about your adversaries on the other side of the coin, I think that's where it gets more interesting. China by far is not only the most capable, but also the most concerning because of their stated desire to challenge the existing world order, to challenge democracy, but then also challenge kind of the US's place on the world stage. And so because China takes a very directly opposed view, with communism, with the way that they work with other nations is very different than the United States and our allies and partners. And so that's something that we've read more about. We talked about in the Department of State and behind closed doors, a decade plus ago, but now it's breaking more open into the common knowledge that you hear China mentioned quite a bit as a challenge we're facing, and especially economically as they continue to try to become a juggernaut. Militarily, also Russia is still a significant challenge, as we've seen with Ukraine, not nearly the 10-foot tall giant that we thought they'd be. They have not had as much military experience as the United States has, but they've had some in the past 2-3 decades. But to see them go into Ukraine, which most strategists thought was going to be a fairly simple exercise for them or an operation for them, and watch how they not only failed to achieve their objectives, but then got bogged down and pushed back by President Zelensky and the commanders within Ukraine, was kind of eye-opening. So they have a lot of capability, but they haven't been able to employ it properly. And then you've got two other nations we always think about, which are both Iran in the Middle East and then North Korea in the Asia Pacific region. Not as capable, not as proficient as they once were, but they still are there. As we call them spoilers, right? They tend to pop up now and again, and you'll see where North Korea will test a ballistic missile to kind of rattle the saber and say, look, I'm still here. I'm still something you need to pay attention to. But that's become, and it has been since World War II and the conclusion of World War II. You had a lot of the way that the international kind of organizations were set up, whether it's United Nations, whether it was the Bretton Woods Agreement, for how the economies were staged. But the United States kind of takes a leading role, and we've got a lot of phenomenal allies and partners we can work alongside. And that's something that China, Russia, North Korea, Iran can't duplicate at this moment in time. So that's a really strong competitive strength we have that others don't.
Well, thank you for that explanation, Guy. It's always it's really interesting to listen to explanations like that from someone who's actually spent so much time kind of considering it and thinking about it and knowing really the details for really your whole career. Unfortunately, we are coming up to that 1 p.m. hour, and so we don't have time for any more questions. But Guy, I want to thank you again for joining us. What a great talk. As always, every time I've seen you, you're really insightful and very engaging. And a reminder for everyone, if you have any interest in reading those books, I think they're both available on Amazon, correct, Guy?
Yes, absolutely, on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. But I would certainly be thrilled if you'd consider snagging a copy for yourself or for others. And then, like I mentioned, if you, through Connor, if you have some connections where you say, hey, I'm associated with this group or this industry that could use a good keynote speaker, I would be honored if you'd consider me for that possibility.
Terrific. Well, thank you again. And just before we go, Colin, any announcements from the council level?
Yeah, just super quick this time. We finalized our NESA applications and selections last night, so there'll be some announcements on that soon for the 2023 cycle, as long with an event date and event location. So look out for that if you're interested to attend. It's always a wonderful evening. And besides that, thank you guys for joining on a shorter notice this week. We did have one of our other speakers not able to make it that was originally on the schedule, and Guy stepped in and gave a wonderful second presentation to this group. So thank you so much for him and for everybody for filling the call. And we'll see you next month, or February, I guess, after our winter break.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Appreciate it, and have a wonderful holiday season.
Thank you.
Yeah.